We begin by offering our condolences to our 12th Imam, Imam Sahib al-Amr, on the tragedy of the day of Ashura. And we ask Allah to allow all of us to be amongst the helpers and assistants of our 12th Imam when he returns to avenge the death of Abu Abdullah Hussain alayhi salam. And we ask Allah for us to be among those helpers of our 12th Imam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran about those who are killed in the way of Allah. And He says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ولا تحسبن الذين قتلوا في سبيل الله أموات بل أحياء عند ربهم يرزقون فرحين بما آتاهم الله من فضله. And the verse continues, and Allah says that do not consider those who have been killed in the way of Allah as being dead. No, He says rather that they are alive in the presence of their Lord, being sustained by their Lord. Indeed, on this tragic evening after the day of Ashura, we recall the fact of the shahadat of Abu Abdullah Hussain alayhi salam and the family and the friends. And reflecting on this verse of the Quran, which Allah mentions multiple times, that the shuhada, those who give their lives for the sake of the preservation of the deen of Allah, of the religion of Allah, are not dead, but they are alive. And the mere fact that we are here today, and believers all around the world are commemorating the tragedy of Karbala, is a proof of the fact that the shuhada, that the martyrs never died, but rather that through the remembrance, through the tears that the millions upon millions of believers especially, that they shed around the world in the memory and the preservation of the tragedy of Karbala, is a clear example of this verse being applied in our day-to-day life, that the shuhada do not die, that they remain on forever. As we know, the tragedy of Karbala is such that it is not only us in this room who lament over the tragedy of Karbala. As we know in the hadith that the angels of Allah lament and they grieve over the martyrdom of Abu Abdullah Hussain. It is not only Rasulullah, our beloved Prophet, who lamented and grieved and shed tears when he was told about the tragedy of Karbala, but actually, as the hadith tells us, that each and every single prophet that came to this earth, they were all told about the tragedy of Karbala well before it happened. And they also grieved and shed tears over the tragedy of Karbala. And as we also have been reciting in the ziyarat of Ashura every night, that this is the greatest tragedy which befell the people of the earth and the inhabitants of the heavens. And how can it not be that fact when Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, where he stood to preserve the religion of his grandfather Rasulullah, on the first night of Muharram, when we began this discussion and the review of the dua of our 12th Imam, we remember that we reflected on the fact that when Abu Abdullah began his movement in the city of Medina, at the end of the month of Rajab in the year 60 after the Hijrah, that he told his half-brother Muhammad al-Hanafiya that he was not going forth to create mischief or corruption or problems on the earth, but rather that his entire mission was, as he put it, that he was seeking to bring about rectification, talabul islah fi ummati jaddi, as he had said, that he was seeking to reform the nation of his grandfather Rasulullah, and that he was following in the footsteps of his grandfather and of his father Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. And just as they also gave their lives for the preservation of the religion of Allah, so did Abu Abdullah alayhi salam also give his life and the supreme sacrifice on the day of Ashura. I'll keep it very brief tonight, just to mention one or two words of the tragedy, because even though the day of Ashura is now behind us, the 10th of Muharram has passed with the setting of the sun this evening. But without a doubt, the tragedy of Karbala continues well beyond the day of Ashura. The day of Ashura was just the tragedy of what happened to the men of the camp of Abu Abdullah. It is the tragedy where we commemorated the men who went to the battlefield one after the other, where the young men, the brave warriors, gave their lives for the sake of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. But as we know, when we read the books of history and the maqtals, the maqatil, that Karbala continued well beyond the day of Ashura. The tragedy of Karbala became much more pronounced, because at least on the day of Ashura, it was the men having to defend, and to defend the ladies. But on a night like this, in the year 61, where there were no more men left in the camp of Abu Abdullah, it was the women, the ladies, the children who were left to defend themselves on this tragic night. Brothers and sisters, as we remember the tragedy of Karbala, let us not forget the tragedy of Lady Zainab alayha salam. Let us not forget that the children of the camp of Abu Abdullah were going through difficulties on these nights. When we look at the night after the night of Ashura, we lament on the fact that the ladies of the caravan had nowhere to go, had no form of protection. What could be worse on this night than the ladies remembering that their brave sons, their brave following, the brothers and sisters and their nephews have given their lives on the day of Ashura. Lady Zainab alayha salam looks and she knows that her two sons are no longer, that Ona and Muhammad have given their lives. When Lady Zainab looks, she sees Abu Fadl Abbas's lifeless body and his body with no arms laying on the plains of Karbala. As they look around, they see that all of the brave men have given their lives on the day of Ashura. But brothers and sisters, that this was not the end of the tragedy. This was not the end of the difficulties of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. They would still have a long way to go before they could make it back home to the city of Medina, to the house of Rasulullah, to the city of Rasulullah. We're told that on the day after Ashura, that first evening after the tragedy had occurred, that the enemy forces began to loot into the tents. Umar ibn Asad gave the orders for the enemy soldiers to go into the tents of the Ahlul Bayt. They began to steal whatever they could find available. They would steal whatever they could find, whatever possessions that the Ahlul Bayt had. They began to loot them one after the other after the other. The writers of the Maqtal mention that it even got to a point that when they went into the tent of Imam Sajjad, that he was sleeping on a small mattress on the floor, and even that they pulled out from underneath him. They went in after they were able to loot from the tents, when they were able to steal all of the things and whatever the Ahlul Bayt had with them as their mean and few possessions, that they began to light the tents on fire one after the other. The historians mention that the ladies and the children would run from one tent to the other. They would go from one tent after it had been lit on fire and go to another tent. And this continued until they went from tent to tent. Eventually they get to a point where there are no more tents left. They go to Imam Sajjad, who's the Imam of the time. They ask Imam Sajjad that what should they do. Imam Sajjad tells the ladies and the children to stay outside in the desert, in the night of the desert. Eventually, as the tents have been burnt, most of the tents are completely burnt to the ground. One tent is still remaining that is torn and in tatters. We're told that in this evening, this night of this loneliness and sadness for the Ahlul Bayt, that not only were the tents looted, not only were the women have all of their possessions taken away from them, but the enemy soldiers began to come and cut the heads off of all of the victims on the day of Ashura. They began to take the heads off of the bodies and distribute them amongst the various tribes. As all the heads had been distributed, and the head of Abu Abdullah had been given to be taken to the city of Kufa. Eventually, one of the last tragic scenes that happened on this night is when Umar ibn Asad gives the orders. He asks his soldiers that who of you is ready to crush the body of Abu Abdullah? As the body of Imam Hussein lay on the plains of Karbala, 10 of the enemy soldiers volunteered to come forth and crush the body of Abu Abdullah. They got their horses ready and they began to trample over the body of Abu Abdullah. Imam Sajjad is quoted as saying that as he was in his tent, although he was sick, although he did not have the energy to really move, but he is reported as saying that he was hearing the sound of things breaking. Maybe it sounded like broken glass or broken pottery. And as he was able to hear the sounds and look and to see what was happening, he realized that these were the ribs of his father, that these were the bones of the body of Abu Abdullah. That as the horses were trampling over the body of Abu Abdullah, every time the horses would trample over the body, more and more bones of the body of Abu Abdullah would break. And as the Imam is seeing this sight, Lady Zainab alayhi salam is sitting beside her nephew, hearing the tragedy, hearing the body of Abu Abdullah go into tatters. وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلِبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ إِنَّ لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Ya Allah, we ask you for the right of Fatima and for the right of Abu Abdullah Hussein alayhi salam and the blood that he shed on the plains of Karbala. That Ya Allah, we ask you to keep us all on the path of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. Ya Allah, we ask you to allow us the shafaat of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam on the day of judgment. We ask you, Ya Allah, to give us the ability to make the ziyarat of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam and Abu Fadl Abbas. We ask you, Ya Allah, to protect the believers around the world wherever they may be. We ask you, Ya Allah, to hasten in the return of our Imam al-Hujjah, and that we can improve in our practice and our understanding of Islam such that we can be amongst the helpers and assistants and adherents to the 12th Imam and his revolution to bring about justice and equality on this earth. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.